You're listening to Conferences Online Allergy from Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm your host, Dr. Jay Portnoy. It consists of a series of presentations by experts in allergy immunology and can serve as the didactic curriculum for trainees in the field. I hope you enjoy COLA.
Well, thanks, Chris. So what I'm going to do in the next half hour, an hour here is talk to you about how to review a journal article. And we're going to sort of go through what is expected of you and the things you should and should not do when reviewing a journal article. I always put up my disclosures. I don't think any of these are really relevant except the last one. As you mentioned, Chris, I am now the editor-in-chief of the Annals, so I do have some insight into what we expect from reviewers. So what I wanted to start with, though, is I don't know how much all of you know what goes on sort of behind the scenes with the manuscript. And so I wanted to put together this sort of workflow for manuscript submission so you get an idea of what's going on and where that peer review process actually falls into play in the process of a manuscript. So initially, obviously, the author is going to submit their paper. And then there's these people that form the editorial team, which is the editorial staff, the editor-in-chief, and then associate editors. And pretty much every journal operates this way. There may be different layers, but this is essentially how they work. And the paper is submitted online, and I don't know how many of you have actually submitted papers or not, but when you do, you'll see there's usually an online submission program that you go through, and that goes to the editorial staff. And they then review what you've submitted for looking just to make sure that you've followed all the instructions and everything that was required in terms of the submission. If you have not, they will then return the manuscript back to you to fix that. So it's important, not so much with peer review piece of this, but in terms of when you are submitting manuscripts and things like that, to make sure you've read the instructions for the authors, you follow the instructions for the authors, that the submission site, you follow the instructions on that as well, because if you don't, you'll just be getting your paper back very quickly to work on it again. Obviously, once the paper has been sort of checked in, all the pieces are there, it looks good from the editorial staff perspective, it then is headed to the editor-in-chief. And then the editor-in-chief will review the paper, and yes, I read like 1,000 papers a year, or at least go over 1,000 papers a year. I can't promise you I read every single one of them. But the editor-in-chief will look at the paper and decide, is this appropriate for our journal? Is it worth moving forward or not? And I say that because there are things that get submitted that are ridiculous. And so these things, if there's the wrong journal, so somebody sends something about, I don't know, lupus in donkeys to the Annals, I'm going to reject that. Clearly, it's the wrong audience. We aren't going to be our readers are not going to want to see that. Or if it's just a really bad study where there's one patient and they claim that they found a cure for everything in the sun or something. So at this point, usually we call these desk rejects, and usually anywhere from 30 to 70%. It depends. A bigger journal has even higher desk rejects. These manuscripts are rejected. So there's no peer review at this point other than the editor-in-chief has looked at it and decided, I don't want to move this forward. And it could be for any kind of reason. If the editor-in-chief decides, I do want to move this forward, so that I don't think that this is ridiculous, this is actually something that's worthwhile looking at least from my viewpoint, it gets handed off to an associate editor. And at this point, then the associate editor is going to review the manuscript. Now, the associate editors have a little more expertise, say, in that field. So there maybe, you have associate editors that have expertise more in food allergy than in asthma and things like that. So if I have I'm more asthma, so if I've got a food allergy piece that I thought was good, I'm going to hand it to a food allergy associate editor. And at that point, they may send it back to me and say, this is crazy and stupid and you're just an idiot. And again, you can get it rejected there. But assuming the associate editor looks at it and says, yeah, this makes sense, this is interesting, it then will go out to peer review. And that's the point where we're really going to spend our time on this talk, is what happens and what are you supposed to do when you do this peer reviewing. And this is really sort of an important piece. You can see the time of submission is on here as well. So that review by the editor-in-chief is usually just a couple of days. The associate editor may take up to a week. And now it goes out to peer reviewers where it may sit out there for up to a month, sometimes longer. And we'll come to some of these issues in terms of why things might stay out for review longer. The peer reviewers review it. They make their comments and their suggestions, and I'll get to that. They don't make a decision, even though you may ask them for a decision. They're really just making suggestions, and those suggestions are returned to the associate editor. Now the associate editor then looks at that and decides, I agree, I disagree, or I've gotten enough information here to make a decision. In this case, if they decide to reject, usually the editor-in-chief just automatically rejects it, and that's the end of that manuscript. On the other hand, they might say to have it revised or move forward with it. That's what the green is representing, or even accept it. The editor-in-chief now will look at the comments from both the peer reviewers and the associate editor, make a decision. They decide to move forward. That revise or accept decision is passed on to the editorial staff, and then that is passed back to the author to revise the manuscript. If it is, and then resubmit it. Now, if it was an accept decision by the editor-in-chief, then that accept decision is actually sent to the publisher. And now the manuscript moves outside of the editorial process and to the publication process. So the publisher, in the case of the Annals, is Elsevier. The publisher then takes that manuscript, copy edits, creates a proof, sends that proof back to the author, and then as an author, you have to sign off on that proof, and then the manuscript gets published. The only difference here that I should mention is that because we use articles in press, most of the journals are doing this now, at the moment of acceptance between the editor-in-chief and the editorial staff, at that point, when it goes from the editorial staff to the publisher, that author's version, which is your Word document basically, goes online. And that's where the article and press piece is. So that's prior to any copy editing. So I just want to lay that out there so you have an idea of sort of how that whole process works. And also to point out the fact that there's copy editors that are creating that proof. And we're going to come back to one of the things you do not need to do and probably should not do as a reviewer is copy edit the articles. That's really not your position. All right, but we're going to focus on this issue of what is peer review and how to do peer review. So this is from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors to define what peer review, and peer review really is the critical assessment of manuscripts submitted to journals by experts. And these experts are usually not part of the editorial staff. And then, as they say, because unbiased, independent critical assessment is an intrinsic part of all scholarly work, including scientific research, peer review is an important extension of the scientific process. So the key parts about peer review is that it's a critical review by an expert who's not part of the editorial staff. And so that's why we really don't consider it true peer review when the editor-in-chief makes a decision on their own, or even when the associate editors do, although you could argue that in a smaller field like allergy, those associate editors may actually be the experts as well. But the idea is that you're really going to outside experts to ask them really what is the unbiased, independent critical assessment of this manuscript. Now, before we go further than that, there's different types of peer review in terms of manuscripts. I think it's important to be aware of these. So there's single-blinded review. These are situations where the reviewers know the authors, but the authors do not know the reviewers. So this is what most journals do historically. And if you've ever reviewed for a journal, what you'll see is you get a title page with the manuscript. And it will say, you could sort of, as you read it, we have shown this, and the Nationwide Children's IRB approved this, and things like that. Those are single-blinded because you as a reviewer know who the authors are. Double-blind review is when nobody knows who anybody is. The authors don't know who the reviewers are. Reviewers don't know who the authors are. Annals right now does double-blinded reviews, which means that you do not get a title page when you get the manuscript because it can't have the authors' names on there. We remove things like the location of the IRB. We could talk about how good or bad double-blinded review is because I have my questions about how double-blinded it really is when you're dealing with articles where people will constantly reference their own work. And so to some extent, if you read the references, you can probably figure out who the authors are as well. But the idea behind double-blind and why we like double-blind is that it hopefully focuses the reviewers on the science and not sort of other extraneous issues about their view of the authors. And then the third way of doing the review, which is actually gaining steam and has sort of been pushed more, is an open review. So going for transparency completely in the entire process. So in this case, the reviewers and the authors know who each other are. The reviewers, when they review the manuscript, the authors won't know who those reviewers are at that moment. But once the manuscript is reviewed, the review is then put online. So then the authors know exactly who did their reviews. The benefit here is it's complete transparency. You're not likely, at least the idea is, you would not likely get reviewers who might have conflicts and issues and sort of go after authors. And the flip side of it is that the authors then will know who their reviewers are, and so it's sort of a fair equal footing between the reviewers and authors. But as I said, most people stick with the single-blinded and double-blinded reviews for most journals. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what peer review is. The key thing about peer review is that you are actually evaluating things like the science. You know, what the methods used. What is this? What are they trying to show? What are the results? What are the conclusions? Is this new, or is this just rehashing the same thing? I mean, you could go out and test whether an antihistamine reduced sneezing and allergic rhinitis. And it would probably be a very nice positive study. It's not novel. It's really, the problem there is repeating the same studies over and over again does not help move the science forward. So those are kind of the major things. We'll talk more about each of these in a minute, but that's really what you want to think about when you're looking at a manuscript. What you should not evaluate, and this is a thing that I can't stress enough, is you are not there to evaluate the writing, the English, the grammar, the style. Now, if the English grammar and style are so bad that you cannot actually evaluate the science, the methods, the results, the conclusions, the novelty, then yes, you can comment about that. But in general, where there's issues with sort of the grammar or some misspelled words and things like that, that will be picked up by the copy editors. It's not really that important for you to talk about. Now, again, as long as it doesn't impact on those other issues, you don't need to worry about them. And what you do not want to do is rewrite an entire manuscript. That's not the point of peer review. If the manuscript's that poor at that point, you probably just need to say that I can't get through it as written. And you may or may not want to make some suggestions. And I say this because I would say probably 60%, maybe even more, maybe 75% of our reviewers come back with a whole lot of English grammar and style corrections. And that's a lot. I mean, that's, again, you can tell them that if you want. You can't do it. But the thing is, that's not really where you need to spend the majority of your time. So keep that in mind when you are reviewing these manuscripts. All right, so now I'm just going to go through a bunch of questions that you really should consider when you're reviewing a manuscript, because I think this is sort of the important pieces to be thinking about while you go through a manuscript. So the first one really is the topic or area of research appropriate for the audience of the journal? So I sort of already told you that the editor-in-chief of the journal should be making that decision, and actually even the associate editors first. By the time it gets to peer review, it should already be in a position where at least the editorial team seems to think it's appropriate for their audience, with some exceptions. So, for example, the Journal of Immunology sends every paper out for review. So the editors there don't make that decision. They let it go out for review and let the reviewers make that decision. But this is sort of, so when you get it as a reviewer, you have to ask yourself, is this something that the readership of this journal would be interested in? And is it appropriate for this journal? It's a simple little thing, but if somebody submits a manuscript that is based on a mouse model, finds a brand new protein that explains why people have MIs when they're 50 years old, and they submit it to the Annals, it's the wrong journal. We don't really do mouse studies. We don't do cardiology. And that's where you sort of have to say, okay, it may be the most earth-shattering paper ever written, but unfortunately, because it's in the wrong place, it's really not right. And so It's okay to say this is a fantastic paper. It just needs to go to a different journal. Then you want to go down next. Is the topic area of research important scientifically and medically? This becomes an issue. You can write a paper on a lot of things, and you can actually get some very nice data that is statistically important, different, and all that kind of stuff. But if it's an issue that's really not scientifically and medically important, then it's not really helping anyone. And when we talk about how you write your reviews, one of the things you're going to talk about is, how does this move science forward? And if that answer is it really doesn't, or I'm not really sure, then I would go back and ask you, well, then that's probably a major deficit of this paper. Why does it exist? So these are sort of big level questions you're going to ask as you start reading that manuscript. Now you start getting into the more details in the manuscript, and the first thing is going to be, does the abstract adequately summarize the paper, and are the conclusions justified in that abstract? That's a huge issue because you have to ask yourself, do the authors really show what they claim to show? And I don't I don't mean this in a negative way, but obviously authors will spin things in a way to make their paper sound more impressive and more important than it might actually be. And I don't think they do it necessarily out of a malignant process, but they can then overstate what they're showing, and you need to sort of really step back and say, is that really being demonstrated here? Once you've got to sort of gone through the abstract, does the introduction set up the situation properly? Does it make sense? If it doesn't, what's missing or what is in there that's not needed? I will say that, people have verbal diarrhea, people have written diarrhea. And so it's perfectly fine, even though I just told you not to criticize English style and grammar, it's still perfectly fine to make a statement that says, you know what, I don't think you need to talk about 85,000 things in the introduction and make it 400 pages long. It's perfectly fine to say, focus it down, keep it limited to what you're actually showing in the paper. So that's sort of things you want to start to think about as you're reading through there. Now, when we get to the methods, and I think this is very important, are they complete? And depending on the journal you're reviewing for, that could require you to look at online repositories as well. It may or may not all just be in the text of the paper. The touchstone that I sort of use for methods is ask myself, could somebody else come in and do this study and get the same results? The easiest example of this is harder with clinical studies, but you can think about it. But if on a bench study, if I'm going to repeat what somebody did with a cell culture experiment, I need to know the cells they used. I need to know where they came from. I need to know the media they put them in. I need to know how long they cultured them. I need to know what they supplemented that media with. I need to know when they took them out. I need to know how they treat. And all of that time and everything has to be in those methods. If you don't have it in there, I could not repeat that same study. I could try, but I don't really know what I need to do. So if they don't tell you all that, the methods are really incomplete. For clinical studies, it's more of a case of understanding where the subjects came from, how, what were inclusion/exclusion criteria, why were some dropped, and then what were all the interventions that were done on these people and when. And so all of that needs to be in there. And again, these are places where authors often don't fully put all that information in there. And it's important as a reviewer that you go through and say, could somebody repeat this? Because the whole point behind the methods is to fully understand what the authors did to get the results they did. And so that's a very important piece to go through. All right, then you go into the results. And you have to ask yourself in the results now, if the authors are really drawing appropriate conclusions from the data. So we all live in our world with our blinders, and we all think our data is the most beautiful stuff in the world. And in fact, our data is probably just as crappy as anybody else's and smells just like everybody else's. So when you're reviewing this, you have to be careful and go through, okay, did they really think about all the other options that could happen? Now again, this is not an opportunity to go nuts and make up, well, if 12 other things that no one's ever shown were true, then we could explain your results a different way. But this is to look at the data as they did it based on their methods and say, could this be something else? Could it all be because you killed all the cells at step 2 and you didn't tell me that by step 3 that the cells were still alive? Things like that. You need to sort of figure that out. And what you're going to do is ask them about these issues. It's not necessarily that they didn't consider them and didn't take care of them. It's they didn't bother telling you about it in the paper. So you will ask them those questions. And again, I'm going to go through a full review towards the end of this, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So have they considered all these other explanations? Have they controlled for them? Does the data actually jive with what the authors claim they show? It doesn't happen often, but it happens. One of the ways authors deal with bad data is that they just obfuscate. They write stuff that just is totally confusing, and you can't really figure out what they did in this, that, where did the samples go, or what happened with the patients. I'm not really sure who got asked this questionnaire, who got this treatment, I can't figure it out. And that's a way often, it could be that the authors are just terrible writers, but it also is a way that I've seen authors to hide fatal flaws. And when you start to come back in the responses when from the reviewer, where you ask these questions, you're going to ask, well, what did you do here, right? And then you'll get an answer back from the author that is either sort of very hard to understand, or sometimes you'll find out they'll explain the fatal flaw. So the example I was sort of using here, which is a bad example, but let's say somebody had a cell culture and they found that they saw no activation of the cells when they were exposed to X, Y, or Z. But in the methods, there's this period, you can't really figure out what happened to the cells. And there was this weird statement about something about washing with water, and it didn't make sense. So the question is, did you wash the cells with water before you added your stimulus? And the answer comes back, yes. Well, here's your fatal flaw, right? Because if you put cells in water, they pop. So, it wasn't put in the paper. It was kind of dumb why anybody would do that. I'm using a really extreme example, but that's the kind of thing where you don't understand what's going on. There may very well be something being hidden there that is a major problem. So again, just keep that in mind as you're reviewing these things. It should read well and it should make sense to you. And if it does not, then as a reviewer, you need to try and figure out why that is. And the way you do that is by querying the authors. Then in the discussion, you want to ask whether or not the information provided makes any real sense. Is it based on the data in the paper? Discussions, usually we allow authors to speculate. Almost all journals allow you to sort of go a little beyond what you've been able to show and think about what this might lead to. But wild speculation is something you may want to pull them back from. So if people sort of go way off the rails, this is a place where you could say, okay, it's, you've shown this and that, and it's worth talking about that, but this doesn't necessarily mean that you've proven that there's life on Mars. And again, this is also sort of like the introduction. Are there things here that are unnecessary? Or are there things that you should have mentioned that you didn't? And again, in the discussion, we like to see things like, what are the limitations? What are alternative explanations? That's the kind of sort of speculation piece that is usually wanted in the discussion. And again, is it way too long? Again, I told you not to be a copy editor, but again, if you feel like it's just sort of going on and on and on and on and repetitive, I think it's worth it for a reviewer to make that comment. When you look at the figures and tables, what I usually want reviewers to do is, do they make sense, first of all? And then secondly, if all I had was figures and tables, do I understand what the study, the take-home messages of the study, what did they do and what did they get out of it? If the tables and figures don't really stand well on their own, then that's a problem. And I would recommend that reviewers suggest to the authors ways to make them better. If the figures and tables don't make sense or are confusing, obviously you need to point that out as well. And then obviously a little bit more to this is, do those figures and tables jive? Jive seems to be my word that I'm throwing in here all the time, but do they jive with the legends and the paper text? I've certainly seen manuscripts where they don't. Where there's actually confusion and actually even disagreement between the figure, the legend, and the text. And that, if you've written manuscripts, that probably happens because there's multiple versions flying around and people don't really know what the latest version is when they finally go to submit. Or it could just be outright errors and they're just very poor writers or maybe even poor researchers. So you want to really point those things out because those are issues that need to be corrected. Because again, if somebody picks up this paper, how do you know what the right answer is if everything disagrees with each other? And then finally, this is sort of the big picture question you want to ask, is does this paper move science forward? Whether it's basic science, clinical practice, doesn't matter. Does it move forward? Does it add to what's already known in the field? And you want to do this as best you could judge. I don't encourage reviewers to go out and try and become an expert. And I'm going to tell you in a minute that if you're not an expert, you shouldn't be reviewing the manuscript. I don't encourage people to go out and try and become an expert in the field. Reading a whole bunch of papers to review the manuscript, in my mind, is an error because at that point, you should not probably have gotten the manuscript. It's okay to go, if there's statements in the manuscript that you don't really know are true and you don't believe, it's okay to go look up a reference here and there and that kind of stuff. But you should not need to basically re-educate or educate yourself in the field before reviewing the manuscript. That's not why the editor should have chosen you to review the manuscript. The editor chose you to review the manuscript for your expertise that you already have. So I just put that out there so, don't feel that you are somehow, when you agree to review a manuscript, agreeing to go through all of the literature in the world to understand it. So it really is, as best you judge the field, does this move it forward? So some don'ts for peer review. So first of all, do not agree to review a paper if you don't have any knowledge and you're not expert in the field. And we'll talk about as fellows what you could do to get experience reviewing so that then you will be. But to be honest with you, when you have completed a fellowship in allergy immunology, you are an expert in allergy immunology. So realize that, at least in the clinical practice of allergy immunology. So if you get a request to review a paper on myocardial infarction in coal workers, unless you have knowledge in that field, your answer should be no, sorry, thank you. I don't know where you got my name, but I'm not that person. So don't agree if you really aren't an expert or knowledgeable in the field. You're not going to help anybody by writing a review that really doesn't do anything because you don't understand the field. Don't agree to review a paper if you cannot complete the review in the allotted time. Most journals give you around 2 weeks. Some ask for only 1 week, some ask for 3 weeks, but most it's around 2 weeks to review a manuscript. If you have the time to do it, go ahead and agree. But if you can't because you've got too much clinical work, life is exploding in front of you, you've got 35,000 grants to write, you got all this other stuff, it's not a negative thing to say, I decline, no, thank you. And in fact, the negative ding is when you say, yes, I will, and they say, okay, your review is due in 2 weeks. And then it's 3 weeks and I still don't have a review, and 4 weeks I still don't have a review, and 5 weeks I don't have a review, and maybe I'll never get a review, I don't know. That's far worse to the journal and the authors, because the authors are waiting for a decision and the editors are waiting on you to review the manuscript. If you say, I can't do it in the time allotted, that is perfectly fine. They will move to somebody else. In fact, most of these automatically then just go to another reviewer. Or if the editors really wanted you to review, they'll come back to you and say, okay, when are you available? Let's just know when we're going to get the review back in so I know that I'm going to get a review from you. What happens if you don't do that, and it just sort of hangs on and on and on, is eventually the editors will find another reviewer or just do the review themselves, but it's just wasted all these extra weeks. And I can pretty much guarantee that almost everybody, that if they don't get their review in within a week of the due date, at least for Annals, they're never going to turn in the review. It doesn't matter how many emails we send them and remind them, those people just will never do that review. So again, if you can't do it in a lot of time, just say I'm busy, I can't do it. That is not a negative on your reviewer record if you want to view it as that. That's actually well appreciated by journal offices because it helps us move on. And if you say yes and you aren't going to make it, you need to let us know. And if you just sort of let it sit out there forever, that is a black mark, that that's a negative on your record. All right, don't agree to review a paper if you have a conflict with the topic or the authors. So if you are having a personal war with Dr. Smith, and this is in the case of a single blinded review, and you know the manuscript's from Dr. Smith, you really need to say, I can't do this. I have a, you don't have to even say it, just I have a conflict with Dr. Smith and stop right there. Or with the topic. So for example, if the topic is a new antihistamine to treat allergic rhinitis, and you are the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that has an antihistamine to treat, a different antihistamine to treat allergic rhinitis, you have a conflict. You don't really want this paper to go forward because it would be competition. Perfectly, just again, when you're asked to review, the easiest thing is you just say decline, and you can just say I have a conflict. You don't even have to explain the conflict. If you're concerned, you can always email back the editorial office. Whenever you get these invites, you can always respond back to them and ask the editorial office, here's my issue, do you want me to review it or not? And then the editors will make a decision. But in general, if you have a conflict with a topic or authors, or think you do, because usually if you think you do, then you just decline. If you have a grant or have published in the last 3 years with the authors, or a personal relationship with the authors, I view that as really a conflict with the authors. And that sort of fits with study section NIH reviews as well. You really shouldn't review those papers. Now, having said all that, if you get a review request from Annals, it's a double-blind review. You won't know who the authors are. You will know the topic, but you won't know the authors. So you won't have the ability to say, I've published with them or not. That onus then goes on the editorial team to notice that before we send it out for review. If you do a review and you realize halfway through you know exactly who the authors are and you now have a conflict, what I recommend at that point is to contact the editorial office or complete the review, but write in the confidential to editor, and we'll talk about that in a minute, your conflict, so that that's clearly stated. And then the editors can do whatever they want with that. What you do not want to do is put any comment on suitability for publication in the comments to authors section of the review. I would say about 30 to 40% of our reviewers do that. That is a big no-no. You are not making the decision on these manuscripts, and I'll come back to that in a minute. You're simply giving your opinion to the editors. The editors make that decision. Good editors will remove statements like, I think this manuscript never should be published, or this manuscript needs to be published today, that are put in that comments to authors. The reason why you don't want that is if just think about if you're an author and you have your paper rejected, and you're reading the reviews, and one of the reviews says, I believe this manuscript should be published. Now you feel like, what happened? Why did I not get published? And it's simply maybe because the editors decided they didn't want to publish it. That statement, if it wasn't there, wouldn't cause a lot of problems, but with it there, it's a huge issue. Similarly, if you're getting published and somebody says, I don't think this should ever be published, you're probably not as upset because you're getting published. But again, we don't like those statements in the comments to authors. It's really not where they belong. They belong in the comments to editors only. All right, so let's talk about organizing a review. So there are 3 basic sections to a review. The first is an overall or general comments. This is really a summary statement on your thoughts about the paper, why you like or don't like this paper. And ultimately, you're going to give a decision to the editors. You're going to say, I think this should be rejected, it should be revised, or it should be accepted, or some version of that. And so this overall sort of will give that idea of why you made that statement. In terms of the next section is specific comments, and these are really the specific issues that you're asking the authors to address. So these usually have major and minor subheadings. Major are the ones that basically you feel like these have to be addressed for this paper to be acceptable. The minor are, whatever. I mean, you know, your figures were kind of blurry. Can you make them less blurry? Your labels weren't right. This is also where people put in their copy editing skills. And then the last section, which is very important, is the confidential editor. And there you really do want to say, I believe this paper should be published, or I have great enthusiasm for this paper, whatever you think about it, or I don't, and the reasons why. And that's really telling the editor why you decided that you thought it should be rejected or accepted at the beginning. All right, overall general comments. 1 or 2 short paragraphs, short. You don't need to write a review that is as long as the manuscript. We get reviews sometimes on letters that are as long or almost longer than the letter. That is not needed. So a short paragraph detailing what the study was about and the major findings, just to prove to people that you actually read the paper. And then you give your indication of what you think is wrong or right with the study. Like I said, don't make comments on suitability for publication. This is going to the authors. And that decision is up to the editorial team, and it does put them in a bind when they make these when reviewers make these kind of comments. All right, specific comments. This is a series of specific issues with the study and the manuscript. Like I said, you go major first and then minor. And I would recommend you do these in the order in which they occur within the manuscript. So major first, start abstract, intro, methods, results, discussion, figures, and then minor, abstract, intro, methods, etc. You don't have to label them as abstract or all that stuff, but just put them in that order. It makes it easier for the authors when they're going through and making their corrections that they're just working from the top to the bottom of the manuscript. You're also going to number all of these comments, and you'll see, I'll show you in a minute, so that when they respond to them, they can respond to reviewer 1, comment 1, etc. And then the confidential editor section is where you say anything you'd like about the manuscript. And this is not going to be seen by the authors. So this is where you tell us whether or not you feel the manuscript is novel, whether it advances our knowledge base, whether it has useful information. You can also comment on worthiness for publication, but I personally don't here usually. But it's also where you can make ethical concerns. So if you feel like this is a biased study or it's unethical, you say that here. I would not say that in the comments to the reviewers because they cannot fix that. If your concern was fixable, like they failed to make a statement about informed consent, you could simply ask, was informed consent obtained? And if so, it should be mentioned in the manuscript in your comments to the authors. But again, if it turns out that they violated the Nuremberg Code, saying that in the comments to the authors is not going to help anything. They can't fix that. That's where you do it confidentially editor, because the answer here is the editor is going to reject because of the bias or the ethical problem. And it doesn't matter, and it's not, you don't want to get into an argument with the reviewer and the author and the editor over what is right or wrong. It's just editorial decision. So that's the difference if you see sort of an ethical lapse, whether it should be in the confidential editor or whether it should be in your comments to the reviewer, to the authors. And then some journals will have specific questions you have to answer. They relate to the impact, novelty of the paper, the quality, statistics, methods, relevance to the audience of the journal. And then someone will ask you whether you want to write an editorial. And it's an opportunity for you to say, yeah, I mean, I like this paper. I got some issues with it. I'd be happy to write an editorial about my concerns and what I think, how this fits into the scheme of the bigger picture of the world. That doesn't mean you'll be invited to it, but at least then the editors know you would be interested. So I've thrown up here an example review. It's kind of small, but I'll just sort of explain a little bit of what is in this so you guys can see. So this general comments, it's a single paragraph. I start off with the authors showing that EBV infection associated decreased specific IgE2. So I'm telling you that I read this paper. And then I'm putting this manuscript into context. The current manuscript is an attempt to determine possible mechanisms of association, and it's a sub-study looking at these cytokine responses, seeing if there's a relationship between IgE status and EBV or CMV serostatus. And then I go into a little bit of my concerns. There is the association of fewer IL-4 producing cells in the CMV seropositive group. The way the data are presented make it extremely difficult to draw appropriate conclusions. You're not presenting data in a way that I can understand it, or your data doesn't support your conclusions. Particularly arbitrary division of results into thirds, rather than presenting data as medians and interquartile ranges, as they did in the previous paper. See, I've read your previous work. I actually am aware of this. Suggest association dependent upon arbitrary cutoff values and therefore not likely clinically or mechanistically relevant. The authors did not find an association between CMV and decreased serum in their larger previous study, so why it is that it's different this time is concerning. So I've sort of put this idea, by reading that paragraph, you already know I am not terribly enthusiastic about this manuscript. It has issues, and I don't believe their data necessarily supports what they're contending in their conclusions. Then I go into my major comments, and I sort of start my methods and work my way down. So the subject demographic data, I want more. They didn't give me enough of it. So I can't repeat this. I need to know more about who you had enrolled. I asked some more questions about the results. Explain to me a little bit more about the IgE sensitization. And then questions about sort of, do they have any way of proving the children who were seropositive did not have chronic infection? An alternative explanation. I want to know, did the authors think about this and how they can prove that they have actually ruled out other explanations? Again, so do that, and then data should be presented because as median plus minus interquartile range rather than these arbitrary groups. So I'm trying to get them to sort of make it clearer and better. Now that's the major issues. My minor issues are, okay, the first sentence, I didn't understand what you were saying. It was confusing me. You need to reword it. I don't rewrite it for them. I just tell them I need to reword it. line 67, shorter or longer time. Again, shorter or longer time means any time. So that's confusing, and you need to clarify that. And then, I occasionally play the copy editor too, and I thought, it'd be helpful to just tell them that sport should be spot. If they do this stuff, that's great. If they don't do this stuff, that's great. It doesn't matter. The major ones are the ones that have to be corrected in order for this manuscript to move forward. And then my confidential editor, okay, I just tell them, okay, in this manuscript, I don't know that the editor necessarily reads all this stuff, right? So they attempt to correlate cytokine production with viral status and make this assumption why IgE is altered with viral history. But the data are not presented in a way that's meaningful. And so that's my problem. And the data at best suggests that there's this relationship that contradicts their previous work. Their previous work had more subjects. And so I suspect that this current data are really subject to a great deal of variation. And as such, and this is that I like to always end with these kind of statements, this study adds nothing to our knowledge base, nor is it especially novel. So you can tell I'm going to recommend reject. And then another piece I put in here, and I recommend this if, I don't have the statistical savvy to evaluate their statistical methods, so I assume they were appropriate. That's a flag to the editor that if you're going to move forward with this, you really should probably get a biostatistician to take a look at the paper as well, because I don't have the expertise to do that. So if you're reviewing a manuscript and there's stuff in there that you don't understand because you don't have the expertise, it's perfectly fine to tell the editor, I just don't know about this, or I don't know this type of test, so I can't review it. My lack of statement on it is not that I think it's correct. It's that I don't have the knowledge to discuss it. So remember, your primary goal is really to provide the editor with an expert opinion on the information, importance, relevance, and plausibility of this study. And it is, I stress this too, it is an opinion that you are providing to the editor. You're doing a service to the journal. The decision to publish or not is that of the editor. So don't be surprised if you say, I want to reject this paper, it's total crap, everything's horrible, and 3 months later it appears in the print journal. It may be that there's other reviewers that liked it. Again, there's multiple reviewers. Or it may be that, simple as the editor has to have 10 papers in his issue, and so I needed another paper, and this was the best of the worst, so we go with it. There's always different reasons for things to be accepted. Oftentimes, I will say that we can have invited reviews that may have very poor critiques. And some of those are going to still end up being published because they were an invited review. So, but don't think your review wasn't used. Your comments are being used to get the authors to improve their manuscript. It's just your decision isn't the final decision, and just keep that in mind. All right, so how do you start reviewing? So, great, okay, this makes a lot of sense. You haven't wasted the last 40 minutes of my life, and I really now want to be a reviewer. How do I do that? So as a fellow, what I would recommend is you talk to your program directors and your faculty. All of the major journals in allergy have trainee reviewer programs, or you can at least review with a faculty member when they've been asked to review, and that will get you into the system that people can understand that you want to review. A really great way to be asked to review is actually publish an article in the journal as a corresponding author. That gets you into the database, and then you can get pulled from that. Other mechanisms is you can contact the journal directly, and you can contact the publisher. I don't know that contacting the publisher is going to necessarily be the best route, but it's an option. Elsevier actually has a site for people who want to be reviewers, but it's clogged up with a lot of people with no expertise, and so I don't know how many journals really use it. So those are options, but the better one is really to start reviewing with your faculty and sort of get into the swing of things within the journals in our specialty, and then obviously publish in our journals. And if you really, 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 really want more, Elsevier has this certified peer reviewer course. This is the link. You can certainly go there. It's a bunch of modules that will sort of go through in much more painful detail than I have in terms of how to become a peer reviewer, and then we'll give you a certification at the end. Not that I think you need the certification to review manuscripts, but it will provide you with one. So with that, it doesn't look like it wants to let me do my last slide, but I was going to take any questions, and it was a picture of me in a hat doing this. But anyway, so with that, I will take questions. Chris, I don't know how we do questions here, so.
Yeah, I'm just going to open it to the audience to ask questions, and I'll throw a comment or two at the end too. So anybody in the listening audience have questions for Dr. Grayson?
They're all out reviewing right now.
They are. They're busy. I thank you for doing this. It's very helpful to see kind of the what goes on behind the scenes. You know, most of us are on the end right now in their early careers where they're writing the manuscripts and submitting, and then something magically happens, and then something potentially devastating comes back, and then you get to do it again. And so it's nice to know the process that goes on behind all that too. And hopefully, you know, having this understanding will lead us to have better submittals in the future too. I do love the comment about does the study move science forward? I think that's a very helpful thing. I know some journals actually have that little box on the top of the article that says what this does for us. Several of our pediatric magazines I know do that, so I'm kind of a fan of that too. I do have one question for you too, because I know journals at times can be very topic specific. It's, you know, maybe more heavy on food allergy in the month of June compared to asthma in August here, and not specifically Annals, but in general. What kind of comments on that? Because, you know, timing could be everything. You might have just missed the big time.
You mean from the author perspective?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I mean, yes. So there is there are cycles to manuscripts, but I would argue that most journals, at least the allergy journals in general, there may be themed issues that you would fall into, but your acceptance rejection is probably not going to be dependent on whether you were along that wave or not. What may happen is if you put in your asthma paper, it gets accepted now. It might get put into an asthma issue that's in November. I guess November's not that far away, but you know, it might sit for a little bit longer before it comes out in a print issue.
Okay.
But all of JCI in practice, global annals, allergy, all have online repositories, and all basically put that what they, at least on the Elsevier side of it, is called article in press. Basically, it's the author's version. It's the accepted version of the manuscript, and those usually happen immediately. Immediately being within a week or two, and they get a DOI and they end up in PubMed. So it's citable, it's searchable almost immediately after being accepted. So I don't think there's a whole lot of missing the boat in terms of that. Now, that's for just regular articles. Obviously, there are times when journals will have calls for articles. If you miss that, then yes, you are probably going to be reviewed in a different manner than you're being reviewed if you're part of a specific theme issue where they asked for everybody to send them articles on X, Y, or Z. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I just noticed some journals have a theme, and I'm always like, well, maybe if it should have been submitted 3 months earlier, it might have been a different outcome. But ideally, it should be based on the value of the manuscript, not just the timing.
And I can tell you, Annals has themes, but the themes only relate to the reviews.
Yeah.
They don't relate to the original articles or the letters. And the one thing I would say, if when you're writing, just to flip this around on the other side, is make sure you answer all those questions of the reviewers, because that's what they're going to be looking at again when they get the resubmission back.
Yeah, and I think that's the underlying value of what we just went through today, because we're understanding what you're looking at as the editor and others as the reviewers to facilitate the better understanding and ideally get into the initial time of submittal. So,
and we're always looking for more reviewers. So I mean, that's again, that becomes sort of if you looked at the timeline, that's the holdup on how fast, the major holdup in terms of how fast you can get a decision on a manuscript, is the amount of time it takes to find and get a review back from enough peer reviews.
I was just looking in the annals on some of the front section, and it had a list of all the reviewers. It's quite a long, lengthy list, but I can understand with the number of articles that come in or manuscripts, why it would be hard to have enough people doing enough of it all the time. So it's quite a lot of work.
And we really don't want the same people reviewing all the manuscripts, because then what ends up happening is it becomes a very insular journal.
Right.
And I don't want it to be the journal of Mitch Grayson.
Got a nice ring to it though, right?
Although it is the Journal of Mitch Grayson, but you know.
All right. Okay. Well, with that discussion, any other questions in the audience?
Dr. Grayson, this is Sonia, one of the allergy fellows at Children's Mercy. I did have a question for you. So if you submit an article, you get a review back, is it understood that whatever the comments or suggestions are from the reviewers, that the editorial team also agrees with those?
Yes, with the caveat being, if there's a comment from the editor before that, they may not. So I can say that I will sometimes say to somebody, say I had 3 reviewers, and one of the reviewers was like way off on a bunch of stuff and wanted like a whole, 35 more things done or whatever. I might say, be sure to respond to reviewers 1 and 2. And, if you have comments about reviewer 3, go ahead and include it, but not critical to address reviewer 3's comments. So and that'll appear on your decision letter just before the reviewer comments. Be sure you read that, because if you get a comment like that, I'm letting you see that reviewer's comments because I thought they might be of some value to the author, but I'm not expecting you to respond to it. In general, what I would do normally if there's a reviewer that I don't think you need to respond to is I will just take them off. You won't actually see those reviews. So in the absence of a comment telling you to do something specifically, the answer is, yeah, the editors have looked at those comments and agree with them.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and realize you could come back in many cases and say, I disagree with this reviewer, and give the rationale for it. Because sometimes we're going to let something go through that we aren't sure whether the reviewer is necessarily correct or wrong. It's really asking a question. And that will give the author an opportunity to come back and make the response as to why they don't need to do that. And now as an editor, I have to decide who's right. But at least I see both sides of the issue versus just the reviewer side.
Okay, so like if you come back and kind of say, I understand what you're saying, but here's why I did it my way, that's not being perceived as difficult or argumentative or whatever you want to say.
Well, it's not. It's also how you do it. So I recommend sort of thanking the reviewer and then sort of explaining why it is you did it, the way you did it, and why you respectfully declined to change it because you don't think that's appropriate. And what people then usually also say, but if the editors want me to change it, we could change it. Right? And now I've made my explanation as to why I think I did it the way I did it and why it was right.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Any more comments? Well, Dr. Grayson, thanks for your sharing your expertise on this today. We really appreciate you're here, and hope we can see you on COLA in the near future again.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Chris. It's been great. Hope I was helpful.
Thank you. You were very much so. Thanks all.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.